I mentioned several weeks ago that I had been reading a biography of U.S. Grant. And just before leaving for England, I came across in it mention of one of those things that you read about but have a hard time believing actually happened, at least actually happened in this country. Maybe somewhere else, but surely such a thing could not have happened here. Now, I'd heard about this particular incident once before, but that was from a source that I had my doubts about and frankly didn't consider particularly trustworthy, but which I now realize had the facts exactly right. It really did happen here. In December of 1862, to be precise, when Grant, who at the time was in Memphis planning his campaign against Vicksburg the following year, issued General Order Number 11, an order which commanded the expulsion from the western part of Tennessee, the part of the state then occupied by federal troops, the expulsion of all the Jews. You heard me right. He ordered the expulsion from a very large area of everyone who was Jewish. Now, the order was quickly rescinded by President Lincoln, who might very well have sacked Grant for this action had not Grant proved himself by this time pretty much the only Union general who could actually win battles. Even Grant himself seemed to have realized that his actions had been ill thought and premature, a hasty reaction to the problem that confronted him. That problem being a flood of merchants coming to Memphis to buy cotton for northern textile firms. The problem being that the proceeds of those sales were pretty clearly going to support the Confederate war effort. And therefore, determined to put a stop to such transactions, Grant blamed it all on the Jews. Not, you will notice, the owners of the textile mills in places like Philadelphia, nor all of the merchants who were buying that cotton, most of whom were not Jewish, nor even the Jewish merchants. No, he blamed and ordered expelled all of the Jews, whether guilty of any such dealings or not. Of course, while his action had little precedent in American history, other than, of course, the ongoing ethnic cleansing of Native Americans, it was far from the first time that anyone had set out to rid a society of the Jews. We all know that this was tried in the 20th century by the Nazis, as also in many places in 19th century Tsarist Russia. No doubt you have all seen Fiddler on the Roof. It was done perhaps most famously in 15th century Spain on the order of Ferdinand and Isabella, but less well known, it was also done in 13th century England, a country to which the Jews were not allowed to return any substantial numbers until well into the 17th century. But as far as I know, the first such expulsion of the Jews took place in first century Rome, when they were expelled from the city by the Emperor Claudius and only allowed to return some years later by the Emperor Nero, an action that was not very popular at the time. In fact, was bitterly resisted by the populace, since blaming things on the Jews has almost always been very popular. I mean, when all else fails, blame the Jews. Which is exactly why the early Christian letter that we know as the book of Romans was written. Since some of the Jews returning to Rome under Nero were in fact Christians, this being a time before the line between Christian and Jew was so firmly drawn. And the problem was that the Gentiles in the Roman church were not all that happy about their return. That is to say, were not all that happy about the return of their fellow Christians, the church itself having been infected by the same anti-Jewish sentiments that were then quite common in Roman society. And concerned at what all this was doing to the church there, Paul wrote this famous letter attempting to bridge those differences. To put it bluntly, to put an end to the bigotry that was then threatening to poison the church. Paul spends the first 11 chapters of Romans very carefully and systematically demolishing any theological grounds for making a distinction between Jew and Gentile, or any of the other distinctions that we human beings are so fond of devising. As he says so powerfully in the third chapter, there is no distinction. No distinction. For all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God and are justified by God's grace alone. And having then made his theological case in these early chapters, in chapter 12, Paul delivers his message, his conclusion. Paul's general order number one, you might say, words that to this day are among the most quoted of all Paul's writings, words that are practically a summation of what it means to live as a Christian. He says here, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds so that you may discern the will of God. Now, because we do hear these words so often, and usually by themselves and out of context, we have a tendency to hear them in a very general way. And in this case, there's nothing wrong with that, because these words really do apply to almost every situation. But the fact is, Paul actually meant them in a very specific sense. When he said, do not be conformed to this world, he was telling the Gentiles in Rome not to go along with the anti-Jewish bigotry that was endemic in that world, as in fact it is in ours, and exhorts them instead, as followers of Jesus Christ, to be transformed. It's the very same word that elsewhere is used to describe Jesus' transfiguration, the word metamorphosis. Be transformed by the renewing of your minds so that you may discern the will of God. Now again, having heard these words so often applied to so many situations, it's easy to overlook the fact that Paul is actually saying something quite concrete here. When he talks about the renewing of your minds, he's using a word, minds, that Paul doesn't use very often. And I think here he means it quite literally. He's telling the Christians in Rome that in the face of the widespread public hysteria against the Jews, they've got to use their heads and not get swept up in that hysteria along with everyone else around them. This, he says, is what they're supposed to do as Christians. It's their spiritual worship. A very important phrase, but a singularly unfortunate translation of what Paul is actually saying. Because here he's not really talking about worship in the sense of what we're doing here. He's talking about service. Now, granted, the church later did use that word to speak of worship, and it's why to this day we talk about worship services. But here Paul means it just in the sense of what Christians do in their lives out of a response to God's grace. And it's not just spiritual service either. Of course, Paul uses the word spiritual many times, but everywhere else it's a different word. In fact, this is a word that Paul never uses anywhere else. And it doesn't mean spiritual at all, except in the loosest of senses. It means rational, or it means reasonable, sensible, something like that. And it makes perfect sense in this context, where he's warning of the danger of getting swept up in all this public fervor and the importance at such times of keeping their wits about them. Use your heads, he's saying. In fact, what Paul is saying here is the very same kind of thing that Rudyard Kipling was talking about in the opening words of his famous poem, If, which begins, "If you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you." That's what Paul is saying. And if ever there was a time when Paul's words had relevance for us, a time when we needed to hear what Paul is telling us, it's now. Because, and for all kinds of reasons, we seem to have entered a time when there is very little serious and thoughtful discussion of the issues that are facing us as a society. Instead, all we are getting from everyone these days are slogans and sound bites and tweets, which are intended not to advance a serious discussion, but to denigrate and denounce and even humiliate anyone who dares to disagree with us. And it's just as easy for the church today to get swept up in all that craziness. Just as easy for all of us to fall into that and be carried along by that kind of atmosphere as it was for the church in Rome in the first century. Which is why Paul's words here in the 12th chapter of Romans are just as relevant to us today as they were to those early Christians in the Roman capital. And I would urge you to listen again to these words and to take them to heart. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds, so that you may discern the will of God. For that is the reasonable service we are called to offer to God. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, to whom be all glory and honor, now and forevermore.